You're now watching Way Back Wednesday, sponsored by Davenport Auto Park, the ride of your life. And also sponsored by Flores Glass, serving the area since 1977 with residential and commercial work.
Well, good evening, friends, and welcome to another episode of Way Back Wednesday. I'm Randy Adcock. So glad you could be with us tonight. Before we get started, just kind of want to put out a word. I had a viewer call me today and say, hey, when are you going to be on tonight? And so obviously there's still some confusion about the change of scheduling. So spread the word around. We start now at 7:30. We run from 7:30 to 8:30. And that will be our regular time slot for the foreseeable future, as far as I know. I've not been told of any additional changes. So if you know anybody who has been trying to get the show and either tuning in too late and missing part of it or forgetting to get to it at all, just remind them or spread the word around that we are now 7:30 to 8:30 Wednesday night. And as I said, as far as I know, that will be the time slot going forward. Okay. Having said that, I had kind of a general layout of a show in place for tonight. If you remember from last week's show, we talked a little bit about the little whistle stops of Medora and Waldo and railroad stops, whistle stops that were on the line between Rocky Mount and Tarboro and various places around. And so that's kind of, but also I wanted to go back and share a few more pictures and the old images from the yesteryear around here segment from the Rocky Mount Telegram back in the 40s. And then last night I got a phone call from a viewer who said, hey, I've just shared something on Facebook I think might make a good topic for your show tomorrow night. And so I said, well, I've kind of already got the show planned for tomorrow night, but maybe we'll do it next week. So I hung the phone up and I got to thinking about it. I said, whenever you get a chance to talk about the railroad around Rocky Mount, it's never a bad time to talk about the railroad. And so I said, we'll try to integrate what I already had planned for tonight and what the viewer sent me, didn't send me, but told me to go check at Facebook. It was actually posted on Facebook. So long story short, we're going to talk tonight a little bit about a gentleman named Jesse Brake. We mentioned him last week from the Medora community. That's on the railroad track line between Rocky Mount and Tarboro. We're going to talk a little bit more and show a few more pictures of that yesteryear around here segment that appeared in the Rocky Mount Telegram back in the 1940s. And again, those pictures are not great quality, but they date back, most of them date back to the turn of the century, some as far back as the 1890s. So picture quality is not that great, but as I said last week, the captions under the pictures just shed some tremendous information and history, much of which we haven't talked about before. So I'm going to have some of those tonight. And again, we talk about the railroad some, and specifically we're going to talk about spur tracks. And if you're not from Rocky Mount, you probably didn't realize how many spur tracks there used to be around Rocky Mount. There's still some out and about for that matter. We'll get to that a little bit later on. And if you're not familiar with the term spur track, a spur track is simply a little offshoot of a main railroad line. It's referred to as a spur. If you've ever been around a chicken, you know a chicken's got a spur on the back of his foot. And I guess that's where the term came from. If you think about a long straight segment of railroad track, and a little short segment comes off, and it usually doesn't go but a few hundred feet or so in most cases. In some cases it can go much further than that. But that's called a spur track, when the main track has a split off and the train track goes to another location. And so spur tracks have been very much a part of Rocky Mount history since the early 1800s, or mid-1800s anyway, when the railroad first came through here. Very shortly after the first train track was put through Rocky Mount, spur tracks began to branch off the main line and go to various parts of downtown Rocky Mount and even further away than downtown Rocky Mount. So anyway, we're going to get into that, talk a little bit about the spur tracks that used to be here and some of the ones that are still lingering around. And we're going to show you some neat pictures, some aerial photographs, and even a really old map showing the spur track that we're going to talk primarily about tonight. Okay, so having said all that, let's get right into this, Lee. Let's go to picture number one, and this is really just not a picture, but a clipping, if you will, from a newspaper back in 1890 in Tarboro. It was called the Carolina Banner, and it predated the Tarboro Southerner, if you remember. That newspaper is still around, I think. But anyway, it talked about Mr. Jesse Brake, and it says, Jesse Brake, who dropped in at the Banner office Monday morning to pay his subscription, in course of conversation told us that in his township that there was at least 2,000 gallons of fine syrup made and sold yearly, that the crop planted each year was increasing, and so was the demand. He remarked that it was better and easier crop to raise than cotton, and that an acre of ground would produce between 125 and 200 gallons of syrup. 1/5 of an acre he had made 50 gallons, and the others he could mention in his town ship an average of 200 gallons per acre. So Mr. Brake was trying a little tobacco this year, it says. He believes practicing diversification, and so it just put out a question, will not others do likewise? So I never knew that syrup manufacturing was such a big deal in Edgecombe County at one time, but apparently it was in the late 1800s. This article came out and said 1890 in the Carolina Banner in Tarboro, and apparently it was a pretty big deal there for a while. All right, let's move on. I mentioned Mr. Brake only because he was a very prominent citizen. He was born in the 1800s, around 1840, I think it was, 1843, I think. But in any case, he was very prominent in politics in the Edgecombe County area. He was involved in a lot of things. This is from the Tarboro Southerner, October of 1890. And down near the bottom, I got it highlighted in yellow there, just so he was on the legislative ticket as a Democrat, running for office. And I'm not certain, but I think he won this election. I think I remember reading somewhere where he actually won this election. But he served in the Civil War. He was very active in the community, big landowner. Just had a lot to do with the early development of Edgecombe County. Well, I won't say early because Edgecombe County has been around since the 1700s. Well before Mr. Brake was born, there was an Edgecombe County. But certainly in the late 1800s and early 1900s, Mr. Brake was very, very much instrumental in developing business and industry and commerce in Edgecombe County. All right, let's move on. Number 3. This article appeared in the Tarboro Southerner, October the 30th of 1890 as well, the same issue. And it reads, a noble ticket. The Democrats of Edgecombe have put a notably fine representative in the field. Agricultural communities are always the purest and most virtuous. Edgecombe's standard bearers are among the best men of the best. I can't, just kind of blurred out there. I'm not sure what that was trying to say. Anyway, it goes on to say, Dr. R.H. Spate, candidate for the Senate, is a professional man. He is a large and successful farmer and true gentleman. And it goes on and says, Mr. Jesse Brake for the House is a typical farmer, honest as the days are long, level-headed, true, and has brought himself to the front rank by his own efforts, aided by fervent practical wisdom, no better man. So, at least amongst other gentlemen in and around Edgecombe County, Mr. Brake was very well respected, apparently, and very much highly regarded. So anyway, fast forward now to the Rocky Mount Telegram, number 4, Lee. In 1939, this was years after Jesse Brake has passed away, and this article appeared in the Rocky Mount Telegram, and it kind of just gives us a synopsis about what kind of man he was, what kind of regard he had among other people around him. A letter received here from Josephus Daniels, Raleigh publisher and U.S. ambassador to Mexico, should be of interest to the older Rocky Mount residents. Among the figures who will play a part in Mr. Daniels' volume of reminiscences to be issued this fall by the University of North Carolina will be that of Jesse Brake, prominent Rocky Mount citizen who died in 1926. In his letter here, Mr. Daniels said of Mr. Brake, he was one of the best legislators I have ever known, and while not a man of college education, he had sound observation, a sense of humor, and friendliness that made me value his friendship very highly. Mr. Brake was born in 1844. I think I said 43 earlier, it was 1844. He fought in the Civil War and became well known throughout the state. He was a legislator 2 or 3 terms, a county commissioner for Edgecombe several years, a member of the school committee for a number of years, one of the section's leading farmers. In addition to these activities, he had wide connections to the businesses of Rocky Mount, being prominent in the Cotton Planters Oil Company. Throughout his life, he was a great advocate of economy in all fields. He died January 18th of 1926. So certainly a very well-regarded gentleman, as I said, not only in Edgecombe County, but in Rocky Mount in general. And finally, number 5, Lee, I found his Find a Grave listing. There's not a picture of him here, a picture of his grave site there, And it lists his birth date, February 21st, 1844. His date of death, January 18th of 1926. He was 81 years old. He had a bunch of kids, and they were listed further on. I just cut this page off just to capture the first part of it. But he had several siblings, brothers and sisters, and as well as, I don't even know how many kids. Someone said 13, I think, at one time. But anyway, the man had a very successful life and lived at the ripe old age of 81. Okay, so I mentioned that I got a call last night from a viewer who said I posted something on Facebook I think you might find of interest. And so I went to the Facebook page, and sure enough, it's anything that talks about the railroad and history of Rocky Mount piques my interest. And so I looked at it briefly last night, and I do all the preparation for the show at my office. And of course, I was at home when the caller called. And so this morning, I broke out my notes and what I had prepared for tonight's show, and I began to kind of snip and clip and move things around and see how we could integrate what this viewer had posted on Facebook into tonight's show. So without further ado, Lee, put up number 6 if you could for our viewers. And this is what appears to me to be a drawing that someone made, and I'm not sure who drew this, I'm not sure how it came to be, but it's a kind of a recollection, if you will, or a reference to the spur track that came off of the Main Street, down there, Falls Road, Jones Main Street, and came across several Rocky Mount city streets and went all the way out to Rocky Mount Mills. Now, if you look at this thing, it's kind of hard to kind of picture how this traverses through the city of Rocky Mount. But as spur tracks go, this was a very long spur track. You just kind of envision a section of train track that runs from downtown Rocky Mount all the way out to Rocky Mount Mills. You can kind of get an idea of how long of a spur track this was. I think we're talking probably a couple, 3 miles maybe. As a crow flies, it may not be that far. But in any case, it was a pretty good stretch of spur track here. And when you look at where this track was routed, and the close proximity to various buildings and business and industry, you start to get a picture of just how important the spur tracks were around Rocky Mount. And this is just one, probably the longest one I should say. But this particular one ran through what was then called Tobacco Town, went by several tobacco warehouses, and went by several department stores. And of course it went all the way to Rocky Mount Mills. And it was a way for merchants to both ship out and receive product and merchandise. And so, prior to the railroad coming through, this would have all been shipped by wagon train or horse and buggy or whatever. But when the railroad came through here in 1840, it opened up a whole new way of getting products in and out of the area. And so if you were fortunate enough to be in close proximity to the railroad track, that made it easier to get your product shipped out and to receive new goods that you would order when they came inbound. If you were not close to the railroad track, however, it was a bit of an inconvenience to either load up a wagon and take it into town to get to the railroad station and go back again to pick up goods that you had ordered when they came in. And so the concept of the spur track was the answer to that problem. It provided a means for these merchants who were not in very close proximity to the railroad tracks in downtown Rocky Mount to get goods shipped out, to receive goods that might be shipped in. And so when I saw this and got to thinking about it, I said, this is interesting, but I wanted to see if I could maybe come up with a little better representation of just how lengthy and just how much of an impact that spur track had on Rocky Mount. So here's what I came up with. I actually found an aerial map of Rocky Mount. And Lee, if you want to bring it back to my picture here, I've got up on my tabletop with me here. The good folks over at Parnell Duncan out on 301 put this together for me. Well, I put it together and they printed it all for me. And it's basically an image that will kind of give you an idea of where the spur track starts and where it ends. And so I've identified the streets. Down here, for example, is Church Street. This is Main Street, the railroad track down here where the spur track branches off of Main Street and then near Falls Road. It comes down and crosses over Church Street, curves around and comes across Franklin Street, comes down a little further and crosses over Pearl Street, goes a little bit further and crosses over Grace Street, and it comes on around. And if you look at an aerial map of Rocky Mountain, there you go, there you go. If you look at an aerial map of Rocky Mountain, you can still see the remnants. You know how these wedge-shaped buildings are? Right in here, let's see, where are we at? Let me back up here. See these wedge-shaped buildings? They were built that way intentionally to take advantage of this spur track as it came through there. And so as you go along the route of this spur track, you'll notice it crosses over Ridge Street right there. It comes by as the old Caramount Mills building there, then it comes up, of course, and crosses over River Drive down here, and eventually ends up at Rocky Mount Mills. And so this particular spur track, there you go, it's going over West Elm Street. I forgot about Elm Street. It crosses Elm Street first and goes a little bit further, and then it crosses over River Drive, and you see the Tar River there. This particular picture, this is the one I had in my records, and so this particular picture was cut off at the top when it was, I guess it was primarily a picture of downtown Rocky Mount, and it just so happened that I was able to capture this part of this spur track. But this is as far as the picture went. It was cut off right there at Rocky Mount Mills before the spur track gets to Rocky Mount Mills in actuality. But I remember as a child walking along sections of this railroad track. My grandparents lived on Spring Street, and I was actually for a short while, I was being babysat after school, I guess you say. It's not really babysat, but after school I would stay with a lady who lived on West Elm Street. And I would walk from Wilkesville School down Peachtree Street, cross over the railroad track there, and go down to Elm Street and go down to her house, where I would say till my parents got off work and picked me up later in the afternoon. But you see, that's a fairly long stretch of road there that comes from downtown Rocky Mount at the main railroad track, and then goes all the way out to the mill. And as I said, all the businesses that are in close proximity to this spur track were able to take advantage of this spur track from a standpoint of shipping out products and receiving things that they had ordered from other vendors. And so it was really a beneficial tool, I would say, in fact, a necessity, because otherwise all these businesses, think about the tobacco warehouse, the tobacco business, for example, and the thousands of pounds, tons, in fact, of tobacco that had to be shipped out. So this route, went in close enough proximity to these tobacco warehouses. Many of these buildings had loading docks, freight docks on the back of the building to access the railroad track. So it was, a necessity, as I said, to get quick access to the railroad tracks so that these tobacco or whatever product it may be onto a train track to get northbound or southbound out of the area. Okay, so this is what I put together. And when I took this to Parnell Duncan today, I took it on a little flash drive and said, can you print this for me in a size that I can put in? I happen to have this frame already. And he said, sure, we can do that. So anyway, while I was there having him do this for me, I happened to look up on the wall, and lo and behold, he had something that caught my eye immediately. I had not seen it before, and it was this picture right here, this map. This is a 1920 map of Rocky Mount. And it's kind of hard to see, but this, make sure I got it right side up, and I do. The spur track we were just talking about is actually evident on this map. Let me get my bearings here. Okay, here's Rocky Mountain Mills, upper left-hand corner, up here. Let's see, Lee's gonna kind of back us out so we can get into view here. Here's Rocky Mountain Mills. There you go, and you can see the dotted line of the spur track as it comes down and around, and comes around, comes through here. You see the little broken line there, and then it curves around. Let me about to glare of the light there. There we go. There you go. That's better. And I'm going backwards here. Okay, there it goes around, and then it curves back into the main track. So you see the main railroad track going north and south through Rocky Mount. But that spur track, this is in 1920. This is a 1920 map of Rocky Mount. And I've never seen this map before, but it was hanging on the wall at Parnell Duncan's. He said he had gotten it from a lady who found it in a book and asked him to make her a copy of it in a large copy, and so he did. And so he had this in a digital format, so he made me a copy as well. And by the way, the young man up there's name is Justin Reams. He's a really super nice young fella, and he today, in fact, made a folder with my name on it for anyone who's interested in those two pictures specifically. And I'll take others up there in the future, but if you want a copy of this stuff, you can go up there and tell him you want to look at the pictures in the Randy Adcock's folder. Right now there's only two, those two right there in my folder. And he'll print you off one. They're $12 a piece just to have them printed. I had my own frames. But they're really good quality. He does a great job, and so I appreciate very much. He stopped what he was doing to take care of me today. That's how good a guy he is. But his name is Justin Reams, and he works at Duncan Parnell. And I realize it's time for our first commercial break. So Lee, let's go ahead and take that break. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about spur tracks. We're going to read a little history about the railroad, some things maybe you didn't know about the railroad in Rocky Mount, and talk about some other towns in the close proximity to Rocky Mount that were influenced greatly by the railroad. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more Way Back Wednesday.
I'm Daniel Moss, owner of Cornerstone Funeral Home, and I'd like to invite you and your family to give our family an opportunity to serve you in your time of need. And we offer a full line of funeral services, everything from visitations to graveside services to cremations on site with a live crematory, as well as a banquet hall to meet the catering needs of our families that we serve. We offer catering service. We offer refreshments prior to visitations and services of our family. And we want to invite you to come and experience the difference here at Cornerstone Funeral Home.
There's a main nerve that leaves your back that goes into your hip and goes down your leg. It's called the sciatic nerve. A back injury can put pressure on that nerve, causing pain, numbness, tingling. Chiropractors can actually help that. At the Hammer Chiropractic Center on Sunset, we know exactly what to do. We have very good relationships with the doctors in Rocky Mount. We like to co-manage people's care. Some medications may help us do our jobs, and our jobs may help their medications work better.
And we're back. If you're just tuning in, you're watching Way Back Wednesday. Welcome to the broadcast. We're talking tonight about, railroad in general, spur tracks particularly. Like I say, I got this call last night, and I was prompted to go check out a Facebook posting in the Rocky Mount Wayback website. I've got a call. Let's get this caller. Hello, caller. You on the air?
All right, that map, before you get away from it, the
Yep.
20th Street map of Rocky Mount, North Carolina, was done by a man named Jonas Wells, and he was also involved in the laying out of the part of Rocky Mount known as West Haven.
And you know, his grandson is a practicing attorney here in Rocky Mount today.
That is correct, a real estate attorney.
Yep, he sure is.
Goodbye.
Thank you, buddy. We'll see you. All right, bye-bye. Yeah, I meant to mention that. I'm glad Eric mentioned that because I had intended to and forgot to. But yeah, John Wells did the map. He was a prominent gentleman himself in the 1920s. And so, and as I say, his grandson is an attorney here in Rocky Mount now. Okay, so as I said before on this show, I learned something every week in preparation for this show that I didn't know prior. And I've been here all my life outside of a 4-year hitch in the Navy. But aside from that, I've been here my whole life, and I love that I don't know all this stuff because it's neat to me to learn this stuff that I never knew anything about. So the ACL Railroad, we're going to talk a little bit about that in just a minute. But, you know, if you're from Rocky Mount, you know the railroad has been critically important to the development of Rocky Mount. And if you're not from Rocky Mount, you may be surprised to learn the history of the railroads in this immediate area and within a 50-mile radius of Rocky Mount for that matter. So when I was doing the research for today's show, I stumbled across an article that I had never seen before and never realized that there was any such thing. But before there was the ACL Railroad, there was a Wilmington and Weldon Railroad. And before it was Wilmington and Weldon Railroad, it was called the Wilmington and Raleigh Railroad. So Lee, put up number 7, if you would, for our viewers. And this little short article here, I found it today looking through some railroad websites that I go to from time to time. And the article says the first railroad in North Carolina, the Wilmington and Raleigh Railroad, began construction in 1836 and completed its first route in 1840. It was the longest railroad in the world, with service from Wilmington to Weldon, Halifax County, and Rocky Mount, totaling 161 miles. It was renamed the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad in 1854 and sold to the Atlantic coastline in the late 19th century. The first North Carolina State Street Rail Charter passed the General Assembly in February 1867, granting the city of Fayetteville a charter for the Fayetteville Street Railway Company to operate a 2-mile street railroad propelled by animal or other power. So and that goes for a different article altogether. I cut this off because it mentioned several other railroads in and around the area. I knew that the ACL Railroad was previously known as the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad, but I did not know that it was previously before that known as the Wilmington and Raleigh Railroad. But the Wilmington and Raleigh Railroad, even though it started off with a bang, in fact, Lee, you put up item number 8 for our viewers, in 1839 they sold like $400,000 worth of stock to get this railroad off the ground. And it was, in fact, a very, very lucrative venture for those who got it started. What you're looking at here is actually a stock certificate from the Wilmington and Raleigh Railroad Bond Company. They issued this stock, and the date on this is May of 1839. And like I said, it was about $400,000 in funds that were raised for construction of this railroad. The strange thing about it is, and I read another article that talked about, this railroad, like so many others that would come after it, most railroads were kind of segmented, if you will. They had different owners for different segments of track and different sections of a town or a town or a state. And so it was a really fairly large undertaking to get all these railroads working together to provide cohesive transfer of passenger and freight and so forth up and down the eastern seaboard. And so you might think that with an endeavor as big as what they were undertaking here, why would they pick a little old podunk town like Weldon's to make a start for a railroad to run as far as it did? Why Weldon of all places? Well, the reason was because Weldon was right there at the banks of the Roanoke River. It was also in close proximity to railroad tracks that were in Virginia. And so it just made sense to put the track there. And of course, Wilmington being the busiest seaport in the state of North Carolina at that time, it made sense to make that the other end of the track. So it ran from one extreme to the other, from Weldon to Wilmington. Number 9, Lee, this picture here I found in a photograph section. This is actually the original railroad office in Weldon from the 1850s. So you can just imagine how let's just say bare things were when they first got started. It was certainly not it's funny, as much money was put into getting this thing developed, the offices were very bare. Most of the effort was put into laying track and putting in, something else that I learned today that I never knew. There was a time when railroad tracks, out of necessity as much as anything else, particularly during the Civil War when so much metal was being used to produce guns and bullets and everything else, there were railroad tracks for a while made out of wood. There were wooden railroad tracks. And again, that was because all the metal was being used for the war effort. There was another gentleman from Rocky Mount, Mr. S.K. Fountain. And we've talked about Mr. Fountain many times on the show. He was a brilliant man by every sense of the word. He was heavily involved with the railroad. And I found an article, I just want to share some of this with you. The title, by the way, this appeared in an article from November of 2019. I don't right off the top see the author's name. I thought I had saved that. Apparently I cut that off. But the title says, S.K. Fountain, Renaissance Man. The term Renaissance Man refers to a person with genius in many areas or a person who does many things very well. Spencer K. S.K. Fountain surely qualified as a Renaissance Man. S.K. earned his bread and butter working for the railroad. He began at the age of 17 as a telegraph operator for the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad, later the Atlantic Coastline Railroad. In 1871, he became the passenger and freight agent in charge of the freight ticket office and shops. He continued that service for the rest of his 54 years with the railroad. He was also credited with being the prime force behind getting the Emerson Railroad shops brought to Rocky Mount. The railroad yard was a major source of jobs and revenue for the area for many years. And it goes on to say, S.K. learned telegraphy in 1867. Fountain was involved in the construction of the telegraph line from Tarboro to Washington, North Carolina, that was completed in 1881. The first message over the line was reprinted in the Tarboro Southerner to Dulcie Battle, the editor. We send greetings. Washington is successfully connected by telegraph. The message was dated April 27, 1881, and signed by S.K. Fountain. In 1880, Fountain, while continuing his work with the railroad, opened Rocky Mount Iron Works. Rocky Mount's first foundry and machine works. This business was located on East Main Street between Maryville and Hill Streets. It was probably the knowledge gained at this business that enabled him to be so successful in some of his other ventures. He is credited with bringing the telephone to Rocky Mount. Between 1885 and 1890, Fountain and his sons, Will and Wyatt, strung a single span of wire from the freight depot at Rocky Mount Mills. They hung the line on trees or poles along the railroad right-of-way of the spur track to the mill. For insulators, SK cut tops off soft drink bottles, hung them on nails, and strung the wire across them. Fountain devised flake, carbon, and cotton against a thin metal diaphragm for transmitter and earphone. A turn of the crank signaled the other end of the line. He did this to establish voice communication between the railroad station and its most important client, Rocky Mount Mills. He installed bells to alert the other end of an incoming call, and the signal was cut off by placing the receiver in a cradle. He was able to alert mill operators of arriving freight and get their requirements for freight cars for loading. This initial effort caused SK to use Rocky Mount Iron Works, which was originally intended for farm machinery, castings, and steam engine repairs, to produce telephone equipment. He found few sources of supply for the necessary magnetos and coils, so he designed and made the castings himself and went into their manufacture. So a gentleman who was instrumental in getting the railroad operational here and bringing the Emerson shops into being was also instrumental in getting telephone service started in the area. And you heard it say there, the most important client at that time for the railroad was Rocky Mount Mills, and therefore the spur track, while it benefited everybody along the route between the main line of the railroad to Rocky Mount Mills, it was put in place because Rocky Mount Mills was at that time the most important customer in the area that the railroad had. Okay, tell you what, Lee, let's jump then to item number, where were we at? Number 9, I guess will be the next one. Number 10, excuse me, number 10. And there we go. I found this picture. We've seen this before, but this was the best quality of this picture that I have seen, because you can actually see there's 3 gentlemen, at least, maybe 4. I think I see at least one more over to the left there. But I never saw this caption before. It says Rocky Mount Mills as rebuilt after the fire of 1869. To the left is the grist mill. So that building on the left, that taller building, was actually a grist mill. And then the cotton mill was to the right. And this was in 1869. If you recall, the mill was burned by the Union troops in 1863 when they came through here on their pillage and rampage and route. Then it was rebuilt after it was burned then. And then, of course, in 1869, it burned again. And this picture was taken after it was rebuilt. And so, again, you've got the grist mill to the left and the cotton mill to the right. And in the previous version of this picture I had seen, it was a little bit grainy, a little bit blurry, and I never noticed that there's actually 3 people there within view, and I think there's at least 1, 2, 3 more perhaps kind of over in the area where the grist mill is, there to the right side of the grist mill. So anyway, it's one of the better quality pictures I've seen to be as old as it is. 1869 this picture is. Very old picture. Okay, let's move on then. Number 11. Another neat thing I found was that in the very early days of placing railroad tracks, this was in Wilmington, by the way, there were very enterprising people who would actually put train wheels on carts and pull them by horse up and down the train tracks. So it begs the question, what did they do when a train came? I'm guessing they would quickly have the horse pull them off the track and let the train pass by, and then have the horse pull them back on the track. That was pretty ingenious there. It also made me wonder about the poor horse's feet. Had to be walking on those metal rails from time to time, even if by accident. But I'd never seen this picture before and never knew that there were actually horse-drawn railroad cars for a while operating, at least in Wilmington. I'm sure other places did the same thing, but this was actually happening in Wilmington. Okay, Lee, let's move on then. Number 12, this was a really good map that actually shows the route of the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad as it was in 1890. And you see up there in the upper right-hand corner, the town of Weldon, and it comes down, goes by Halifax, and of course then Rocky Mount. You see a track that intersects right there at Rocky Mount and goes east toward Tarboro and west toward Spring Hope. And in fact, I've got a neat story to tell you about Spring Hope in just a minute, but we'll go on. The line continued on down toward Goldsboro down there, and then very further south toward Wilmington. It goes through multiple little small cities and towns down there. So, as I said, when this track section was first put into use, first built, first completed, it was the longest railroad in the world. Now think about that. It's hard to imagine with all the massive expanse of railroad track literally spanning the country and indeed the globe now. Every civilized country in the world has a railroad track, many in fact. But when this was completed, this was the longest railroad track in the world, and right here in North Carolina between Weldon and Wilmington. So interesting there. Okay, Lee, I tell you what, let's do. Let me just read I mentioned Spring Hope a while ago. I wanted to just kind of give you a little information here about Spring Hope. I just thought this was interesting. I found this little article. There's not a picture that goes along with it, so we'll just leave this picture up on the screen if you like, Lee. It says, and this was written by Michael Brantley. Some of you may know this gentleman. I personally do not know him, but he's got a website, and he's a writer, obviously, and writes brilliantly. But it says Spring Hope is located in Nash County, North Carolina, about 45 minutes directly east of Raleigh. Spring Hope has a quirky history, he says. A man named Crenshaw helped establish the community in the mid-1800s near a series of springs that legend says the settlers hoped, in parentheses, or quotations, pardon me, would never dry up. A post office and a stagecoach inn were established. In 1886, the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad began laying track to connect Rocky Mount and Raleigh. A wealthy mill operator, Webb's Mill, and landowner James T. Webb was directly in the proposed path and raised the price of his land so much the railroad decided to stop before it got to his property. This was about 4 miles away from the original Spring Hope. Since Spring Hope was the nearest post office, the railroad applied to call the depot area, which had previously been called Pine View, by the same name. Within a year, a town sprouted around the depot, which they called Spring Hope. Legend has it that the new Spring Hope had 11 taverns. There aren't that many towns that just pack up one day and move 4 miles down the road. The previous village became Old Spring Hope. A store remained there for at least 90 years, and I remember visiting a time or two as a child, but never bought anything. Well, it just so happens I have been in the store at Old Spring Hope, and it used to be one of our stops. A friend of mine his family had some farmland up in Spring Hope, out in the rural section there, and we would go hunting and fishing up in that area, and quite often we would stop at Old Spring Hope, a little store there on the side of the road that was called Old Spring Hope, and we would get, nabs or Coke or something to drink or whatever we needed, and head either onto the hunting grounds or either back to Rocky Mount after a day of hunting or fishing. So I'm very familiar with that area up there. It says older folks recall that the proprietor never recorded a sale because he felt someone else might come along and want that. Old Spring Hope Road runs from the county seat of Nashville almost to Franklin County in the south, but it is considered a back road. When Spring Hope relocated itself to the railroad spur, it saw its boom. The old downtown still exists, and several streets are lined with beautiful examples of early 20th century architecture. There was a movie theater, a Western Auto, a few farm stores, a dime store, a couple of upscale ladies' clothing stores, restaurants, butcher shop, banks, and a couple of garages and full-service gas stations, a park, a school, and an old seed store. F.D. Bissett had a thriving business in Spring Hope for many, many years. Sadly, it closed up some time ago and no longer in business. But I have some real fond memories of going through Spring Hope. As I said, a friend of mine, his family had this big farm out from Spring Hope out in the country, and we would go out there and spend all day sometimes hunting, fishing, gallivanting around the countryside. So fond memories for me of that area up there. And I see by the clock it's time for our next commercial break. So Lee, bring it back to me. When we come back from the break, we're going to talk a little bit more about spur tracks around the area, people who were instrumental in developing those spur tracks for various business and industries. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more Way Back Wednesday.
I'm Daniel Moss, owner of Cornerstone Funeral Home, and I'd like to invite you and your family to give our family an opportunity to serve you in your time of need. And we offer a full line of funeral services, everything from visitations to graveside services to cremations on site with a live crematory, as well as a banquet hall to meet the catering needs of our families that we serve. We offer catering service, we offer refreshments prior to visitations and services of our family, and we want to invite you to come and experience the difference here at Cornerstone Funeral Home.
There's a main nerve that leaves your back that goes into your hip and goes down your leg. It's called the sciatic nerve. A back injury can put pressure on that nerve, causing pain, numbness, tingling. Chiropractors can actually help that. At the Hammer Chiropractic Center on Sunset, we know exactly what to do. We have very good relationships with the doctors in Rocky Mount. We like to co-manage people's care. Some medications may help us do our jobs, and our jobs may help their medications work better.
And we're back. The topic tonight is railroad spur tracks and people who were involved with the railroad and with spur tracks around Rocky Mount and eastern North Carolina in general. As I said at the top of the show, every week that I do this show, while doing research, I uncover things and come across things that I personally didn't know. I assume a lot of other folks didn't too, especially if you're not from Rocky Mount originally. Now, I am. This is my hometown. So I feel it's a little bit embarrassed about not knowing some of this information, but I'm glad that I'm uncovering it because it's interesting to me, and I hope it is for you as well. One interesting thing that I uncovered today, literally, was that down at the old Emerson Railroad shops, there's a grave down there. And if I've ever heard this story, I don't remember. I'll say I forgot it if I've ever heard it. But lead number 13, this is a fairly long article, and I just snapped a picture of it and put it up for display so you can see the headline. And I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs. But item number 13, Lee, July the 6th, 1976, this article appeared in the Rocky Mount Telegram. And it talks about a gentleman named William Daughtridge. You see the headline, William Daughtridge, early pioneer, was influential in railroad location. Very few people know that the mortal remains of one of Rocky Mount's founding fathers is near a deserted coal chute and no longer used water tank in the South Rocky Mount area. The property now belongs to the Seaboard Coastline Railroad. Now keep in mind, this was in 1976. This article appeared in the Rocky Mount Telegram. Here for many years paused the great locomotives that helped put Rocky Mount on the economic map. The engines took on coal and water, while the engineers with oil and waste groomed the great iron beast for their labors ahead. The stop was a practical one, but in another way it was a poetic tribute to a man responsible for the railroads being here. The grave of this man lies east of the refielding station in a range of beautiful pine trees. In a decade past, this weeded lot was used by the legendary Hobo Bill and his comrades as a home away from home, while they dodged the railroad bulls when the sound of train wheels clicked over the coupling joints. The hobos would creep out of the glen and climb through an open door to catch a freight train on the fly. They knew little and cared less about the historical importance at the consecrated ground where they had rested. Nestled in the middle of these whispering pines is a small family burial plot. Here, almost obscured by the passage of time, is the grave of one of the early pioneers of Rocky Mount, William M. Daughtridge. And it goes on to tell about his exploits here in the city and how instrumental he was. Now, we just talked a few minutes ago about S.K. Fountain and how involved he was in getting the railroad here and the Emerson shop started. And Mr. Daughtridge here, I did not recall coming across this gentleman's name before, but in many ways, just like S.K. Fountain, Mr. Daughtridge was very instrumental in the early process and operation of the Emerson shops. I don't know, frankly, if his grave is still there. I don't know if he's still buried out there at Emerson shops. I intend to do a little more digging to see if I can verify one way or the other. But in any case, apparently in 1976, his remains were still out there on the grounds of the old Emerson Shop Railroad. Okay, real quickly too, I want to just kind of share a little more information I found about the railroad in general. This is an excerpt from an article called A History of the Atlantic Coast Railroad. And one of the things I found when I was doing the research for today's show, or tonight's show, was that there's some discrepancy depending on whose article you're reading and when it was written. There's some discrepancy, particularly about when the merger happened between the earlier railroads that eventually became the ACL, when the ACL came into existence and so forth. This article starts off saying the Atlantic Coast Railroad was formally established in 1889. The Atlantic Coastline consolidated the operations of more than 100 separate small railroad companies that stretched along the coast of the Atlantic Ocean from Virginia to South Florida and westward into Georgia and Alabama. By 1950, the Atlantic Coastline possessed more than 5,500 miles of rail. And it goes on to talk about the different railroad systems that the Atlantic Coastline purchased and merged with over the years. It says, the Atlantic Coastline's genealogical chart was the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad on March 7, 1840. The Wilmington and Weldon Railroad opened a 161-mile track from Wilmington to Weldon. The track represented the longest continuous railroad in the world at that time. We mentioned that earlier. And it goes on to say during the 1840s and 1850s, railroad companies experienced unprecedented growth and they enjoyed tremendous economic success. By the time of the American Civil War, rail had displaced water as the primary means of transportation in America. However, during the first 2 years of the Civil War, federal forces sabotaged railroads throughout the South. They destroyed bridges, water stations, and railroad cars. Southern rails deteriorated and fell into a state of disrepair during the late 1860s. Then it goes on to say during the 1870s and 1880s, the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad closely managed the various companies in the network, beginning the difficult process of integration and consolidation. In 1886, for example, the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad ordered all affiliated companies to change their track gauge to a standard 4-foot, 8.5-inch width. In addition, all train and cars were re-wheeled. The Wilmington and Weldon completed the process of assimilation in 1889 when they formally established themselves as the holding company for all affiliated lines, and they officially changed the name to the Atlantic Coastline Railroads. So I've seen other articles that suggest that this happened in 1900, for example, or 1899. This particular article says it happened in 1889. So it's not unusual when you're looking back this far back for there to be some discrepancy sometimes in dates and so forth. It happens. But let's move on, Lee. Number 14. This is one of those yesteryear around here, and ironically, it was a picture I had intended to share tonight anyway, but it fit right in. And we talked a little bit about the Atlantic Coastline Railroad Hospital last week. This is another picture that just happened to be in that yesteryear around here. And it said its first hospital located in Rocky Mount, construction started in 1899 and was completed and opened for employees and members of their families the following year. The hospital, a frame structure, had a 40-bed capacity and was under the direction of Dr. Isaac Mannings, who was later a member of the medical faculty of the University of North Carolina. And of course, this appeared in the Rocky Mount Telegram in 1943. So it says now he's retired and lives in Chapel Hill. I'm sure the gentleman is long deceased by now. While the building pictured above was the first hospital in Atlantic Coastline, this road acquired a second hospital at Waycross, Georgia, about 1900. They acquired what was known as a plant system, which comprised a rail in Georgia and Florida, heading up in Savannah. The building shown here burned in 1921, and of course it was rebuilt later on. So there were actually two Atlantic Coastline railroads. Let's move on to number 15. This is a picture we've seen many times on the show of the Emerson shops, and it's again from the yesteryear around here. And as I said a while ago, it's kind of ironic because I had planned on showing some of these pictures tonight anyway from this yesteryear around here segment in the paper from the 1940s, and it just so happened it kind of jives with the spur track conversation. So anyway, Emerson shops at Atlantic Coastline 30 years ago, and again, this is from 1943. This appeared in the Rocky Mount Telegram. So it's talking about 1910, 30 years prior. Although still a part of the present structure, it has been materially enlarged by the addition of greater height, which was necessitated by the repair of larger and longer locomotives. While greater floor space in practically all departments has been made necessary, and many new departments and undertaking added. So the name of the Emerson shops was accorded to a tribute to a popular and beloved general manager of the company, Mr. T.M. Emerson, in Wilmington, North Carolina, whose passing occurred in the period between 1900 and 1910. He was one of the pioneers in railroad operation and it was under the period of his official direction that the ambitious undertaking of double tracking was dreamed up and plans began to take form. Okay, Lee, let's move on. Number 16. This appeared December 31st of 1942, and it's Rocky Mount's first dentist in a photo with his family, Dr. Wiley Ad Ricks, who practiced dentistry in Rocky Mount 70-odd years ago. And again, this picture appeared in the Rocky Mount Telegram in 1942. I'm not sure when it was taken, but it says 70 years prior that he was a practicing dentist, so sometime in the late 1800s, obviously. His home was a 100-acre tract of land near the present spur track to the mills, and he embraced a part of what is now the site of Caramount Mills, version of Sidney Blumenthal and Company. And in 1942, his home was still standing, an unpretentious structure near the railroad. So, and the reason I wanted to include it is because just like the railroad itself caused industry and business to spring up all around it, quite often people lived in very close proximity to these railroad spur tracks, and indeed the railroad itself for that matter. But it was convenient for a number of reasons to be close to a railroad, or at least a spur track. Number 18, Lee, January 29th of 1943, this picture appeared in the Rocky Mount Telegram, and it dates back between the period of 1898 and 1910. No, it says between the period of 1898 and 1910, Rocky Mount was without its fair, due in part to a geographic difficulties as well as a lagging in public interest. The first fair was inaugurated in the late 1880s as an elaboration of the riding tournaments that were held annually at Old Sparta in Edgecombe County, and the fairs were held in the vicinity of the present Brownsville Park and between Falls Road and the railroad spur track to Rocky Mount Mills. I saw several references to the spur track. Number 18, Lee, if you would get that up, that's the one we're talking about now. There you go. But this is a picture of the fair from that time frame, early 1900s. And it says the acreage there was purchased by a corporation of local public spirited citizens from the Herring estate of Wilting. The land was cleared, buildings built, and a racetrack constructed by the corporation known as the Rocky Mount Fair Company. So we talked before, you know, the fairground out on 64 between Rocky Mount and Tarboro is what many of us remember as the Rocky Mount Fairgrounds. Prior to that, of course, it was down at the end there of down from Pat's Drive-In, Fairview Road, that area out there. That's where Fairview Road got its name, because the fairground used to be out there. Prior to that, of course, it was down here in this area off of the spur line, not too far from Falls Road, there by Brownsville Park over there, present-day Brownsville Park. So again, the spur track became a means of giving direction, telling people how to get places. Number 20, Lee, this was a picture that appeared in the Rocky Mount Telegram in 1943, but it dates back again to 1910, was when the picture was actually made. And it said the picture was made at the fairground during Fair Week, and its refreshment booths were quite popular in the day. It was often embraced as an opportunity to add to the sum total of what was in the treasury of some church. And it goes on to talk about churches being involved in putting up these booths and so forth at the fair. And it makes a mention of the fair being there at the spur track, now again by the Brownsville Park area, present day. Number 21, Lee, we're almost out of time here. This article appeared in Rocky Mount Telegram December 6, 1963, and you see its headline simply Spur Track. And it says the City Council last night authorized an agreement granting the Atlantic Coastline Railroad an encroachment to put a spur track across South Church Street to serve Ward Baking Company. The track, as proposed, will run along portions of the Renfro Street right-of-way and cross the Church Street right-of-way in the vicinity of Renfro Street. Railroad officials said the baking company will start receiving flour in bulk lots by rail. The agreement will specify that all improvements be made at the expense of the railroad and/or industry, that flashing signals or crossing gates be installed if needed, that cars not be allowed to stop or stand on the track inside the street right away on Renfro or Church Street, and that the area be graded. So again, it just kind of points to how beneficial these spur tracks were to local businesses. And they were at one time anyway, all over Rocky Mount. If you look at a map from the 1950s, for example, you can, and zoom in, you can see spur tracks coming off the main line, left and right, east and west, many of them in fact. 1951, Lee, number 22, this article appeared in the I'm Thinking by an old reporter column, and it says that spur track north of Goldleaf Street on the west side of the railroad main line was extended beyond Thorpe and Rick's factory in order to accommodate a distillery isn't a fact known to all citizens. For about 10 years, the industries of the city included the I.C. Shore and Company's distillery, and the company had places of business here and in Winston-Salem. It continued until the state voted prohibition in 1910, and their product, what the trade referred to as a very high-grade corn whiskey. It was sold both to those who bottled further as a base for bourbon, as well as for those who wanted a straight corn whiskey. So, again, the spur track that we were just talking about there, just north of Goldleaf Street, was taken advantage of, I guess you could say, by the distilling company that made whiskey back in the 1900s. Never knew that existed. And lastly, Lee, one more before we go out here tonight. Number 23, this ad appeared in 1950, and it says available for lease, motor bearings and parts building, 223 South Main Street with spur track. So I never knew, number one, that motor bearings was on Main Street. If I did, I'd forgotten that too. My last recollection, they were on Church Street. But in any case, it was advantageous, certainly a selling point, if you had a building for sale and you could say that it had a spur track joining the building or coming up to the building, because again, it made it very easy to get parts and inventory in, and product out if you needed to do that. I had a few more I wanted to share with you. I'll save these till next week's show. We've run slam out of time tonight. So Lee, bring it back to me. We're going to close it up here. I want to thank those who called in, and hope you learned something tonight. I certainly did while getting prepared for tonight's show. As I said, it's interesting to me to learn these things. I haven't been born and raised in Rocky Mount and been here basically all my life, certainly all my adult life anyway. It's just been really fascinating to learn about these things that have been here and are no longer here, but were certainly a major part of Rocky Mount in its early days. So thanks for tuning in, folks. Have a great week. Take care of yourselves. Be kind to one another, and we'll see you next week with more Way Back Wednesday. Good night.